The suitcase hit the cabin floor and split open. A legal file and a handwritten letter slid across the boards, carrying the name Vincent Ashford, the man secretly moving to seize Montgomery Dynamics. Outside, the blizzard had cut off every road back to the city. Carson Bennett had only come looking for firewood. Before he could put anything back, Claire Montgomery's boots sounded behind him, hide what he had seen, or face the woman he had spent 2 years hating. But the secret inside that suitcase, was it really the thing he was thinking? The road up the mountain had been clear at noon. By 4 in the afternoon, it was gone, buried under a white, the color of wet paper, and the shuttle vans that had carried the leadership team up to the lodge were already halfway back down without them. Carson Bennett stood at the lodge window with his coat still on and watched the last taillights disappear into the weather. Behind him, 22 people from Montgomery Dynamics were being handed room keys and hot cider, laughing the way people laugh when a schedule collapses and nobody is at fault. He did not laugh. He had driven up separately in his own truck because the company retreat was 3 days he could not afford, and he had planned to leave early. He had been a senior operations specialist for 2 years. In that time, he had cut freight costs by 19%, rebuilt a supplier network everyone else had written off, and never once been thanked by the woman whose name was on the building. Claire Montgomery signed things. She approved things. She sat at the head of tables and asked questions that landed like scalpels, and when the answer was wrong, she moved on without raising her voice, which somehow made it worse. The whole company was afraid of her. Not the loud kind of afraid, but the quiet kind, where people rehearsed sentences in the elevator before a meeting and checked their slides 4 times. Carson had watched a director with 15 years of service walk out of a quarterly review with his hands shaking. Claire had said 9 words to him. Carson had counted. He knew what people said about her in the parking garage, that she had cut 200 jobs in a single morning and gone straight into a lunch meeting, that she had never in 6 years as chief executive attended a single retirement party. Carson had never bothered to check whether any of it was true. It fit what he saw, and what he saw was enough. The lodge manager came through the great room at 5 and told them the pass was closed. Not delayed, closed. A wall of snow had come down across the switchbacks near the summit, and the county would not have plows on it before morning at the earliest. Nobody panicked. There were beds, there was food, there was a fireplace the size of a garage door. Then the power went. It did not flicker. It simply stopped, and the great room dropped into a gray half-light, with the storm pressing against every window. The lodge ran on a single feed off the mountain grid, and somewhere below them, a line had come down under the weight. The manager said the generator would carry the main building. He said it with the confidence of a man who had not tested it recently. The generator carried the main building for 40 minutes. Then it carried the kitchen. Then it carried nothing, and the temperature inside started falling toward the temperature outside. The great fireplace would keep the room alive, but it would keep 22 people alive in one room on the floor with no stove and no beds. There was a second structure on the property, a guest cabin about 600 yards up the ridge built before the lodge, with a wood stove and a stone chimney, and no dependence on anything electrical. It slept too. The manager offered it, and the room went briefly awkwardly quiet, because everyone understood that whoever went would be leaving the group. Claire Montgomery said she would take it. She said it the way she said everything without Wade already reaching for her coat. Then she said the operations team should send someone who could work a wood stove, because she could not. And she was not going to pretend otherwise in front of a room full of people who worked for her. Every head turned to Carson. He thought about saying no, and he thought about it for the length of one breath. Then he thought about his mortgage and about the fact that in 2 years he had never once told Claire Montgomery no, and he picked up his bag. The walk took 18 minutes and felt longer. The wind came sideways off the ridge, and the snow was no longer falling, so much as traveling horizontal and dry, filling the tracks behind them almost as fast as they made them. Claire walked ahead without speaking, carrying a hard-shell suitcase in one hand, the kind of case built for airports and boardrooms, and she never once asked him to take it. The cabin was one room and a loft, 2 windows, a plank floor gone dark with age, a wood stove squatting in the corner on a bed of fieldstone. Whoever had used it last had left the kindling box empty and the door latched from the outside. The air inside was colder than the air outside, the way closed spaces get in winter, and it smelled like old smoke and dust. Carson found the lantern. Claire found the thermometer nailed beside the door, looked at it, and did not report the number out loud, which told him enough. She set her suitcase against the wall by the far bunk, took off her gloves finger by finger, and looked at the stove. "How long to make that useful?" she asked. "Depends what's under the porch," Carson said. "If there's dry cordwood, an hour to real heat. If there isn't, we're going to have a long night." Claire pulled out her phone, held it toward the window, then set it face down on the table. No bars. Not one. Carson checked his own out of reflex and got the same answer. The storm had taken the mountain repeater down with the power line, and there was no landline in the cabin, because there had never been a line run up the ridge in the first place. Nobody was coming for them tonight. Nobody could. "Then I'd suggest you start looking," she said. The porch was the obvious place, and the porch was a disappointment. Someone had stacked wood there years ago and left it uncovered, and what remained was gray and wet through the kind that would hiss and steam and never give a flame. Carson brought in what he could salvage anyway and stood it against the stone to dry, knowing it would take a day it did not have. Inside, Claire had taken off her coat and was going through the cupboards with a flashlight, setting things on the table in a line. Canned soup, a tin of crackers, matches, a bag of coffee that had been opened and clipped shut by somebody who had left the mountain a long time ago. She worked fast and without comment, and Carson noticed she did not hand anything to him or ask his opinion. She built an inventory and let him see it. "There's a trunk in the corner," she said, not looking up. "Under the loft ladder. If somebody kept dry kindling, that's where it would be." The trunk was cedar heavy, banded at the corners with iron, and it had been shoved back against the wall at an angle that suggested it had not moved in a decade. To open the lid, he had to pull the whole thing forward into the room, and there was not much room to pull it into. Carson got his hands under the front edge and hauled. The trunk came free of the wall in a single lurch, heavier than he had judged, and the far corner of it swung wide and caught the hard-shell suitcase standing against the bunk. The suitcase went over. The latch had not been closed. She had opened it for her gloves and never shut it, and it hit the floor and split open. A thick legal file slid out across the boards and stopped near his boot, and a handwritten letter folded once came loose from the pocket where it had been tucked. Carson did not touch anything. He did not have to. The file had a cover sheet, and the cover sheet had a name printed across the top, in the flat block type law firms use when they want a document to look inevitable. Vincent Ashford. Everyone at Montgomery Dynamics knew that name. Ashford had spent the past year building a position in their stock through 3 separate holding entities, and the finance floor talked about it the way people in a coastal town talk about a hurricane offshore. He was not a competitor. He was a man who bought companies, took them apart, and sold the parts, and he had made no secret of the fact that he considered Montgomery Dynamics undervalued and badly run. The letter was face up. Carson could read the salutation without moving. Vincent, just the first name in ink, in a hand he had seen 100 times on approvals and memos, small and hard and slanted forward. He crouched down. He told himself he was gathering it up, and for about 4 seconds that was almost true. Then his eyes went to the top page of the file, to the words "Transfer of Controlling Interest to a Schedule of Share Classes" with numbers beside them, and to a signature block at the bottom with 2 names on it. Hers and his. 2 years of watching her cut departments to the bone. 2 years of hearing her talk about discipline and stewardship and the long view while she looked through people who had given their careers to that company. And here it was, on the floor of a cabin at 11 degrees. A private letter and a private file carried up a mountain by hand instead of sent through the company's own systems, because anything sent through the company's systems could be read by the company. She was not defending Montgomery Dynamics from Vincent Ashford. She was selling it to him. Carson stayed on his heels with his hands over the papers and felt something in his chest go very cold and very quiet. It was not shock. That was the part that would stay with him later. It was not shock at all. It was what a man feels when a thing he has believed without proof is handed to him in writing, and the ugly relief of being right. A floorboard creaked behind him. Claire's boots stopped about 6 feet back. She had crossed the room from the cupboards, and the flashlight in her hand threw his shadow long across the papers on the floor. Carson had perhaps 2 seconds. He could stand up holding the file and ask her what it was. He could put it in his coat, or he could do the third thing. He gathered the pages square against the boards, slid the letter back into its pocket, laid the file on top of it, and closed the suitcase. He set it upright against the bunk, exactly where it had been standing, and pressed the latch down with his thumb until it clicked. "Trunk got away from me," he said, without turning around. "Knocked your case over. Nothing's damaged." The silence behind him lasted longer than it needed to. "Is anything missing?" Claire asked. "No." She came forward then, past him, and put one hand flat on top of the suitcase. She did not open it. She did not check. She stood there with her palm on the shell, and Carson, watching from the corner of his eye, understood that she was not confirming the case was closed. She was confirming that he had been alone with it. "Thank you for putting it back," she said. He could not read her voice. He had never been able to read her voice, and for the first time in 2 years, that bothered him, because now it mattered. Carson went back to the trunk. Inside, under a folded canvas tarp, there was dry kindling, a whole box of split cedar, and beneath that, 9 lengths of hardwood somebody had cared enough to store properly. It was the best news of the day, and he felt nothing about it. He built the fire the way he had built fires since he was old enough to be trusted with matches shavings, then pencil-thin splits, then wrist-thick pieces laid in a square. The stove drew badly. At first coughed smoke back into the room. Then the flue warmed, and the draft caught, and the whole thing began to breathe. Within an hour, the room was survivable. Claire heated soup on the stovetop and set 2 bowls on the table. She had rolled her sleeves. Her hair, which was always exactly where it was supposed to be, had come loose on one side, and she had not fixed it. She ate standing up, looking out the black window at nothing. "They'll open the pass tomorrow if the wind drops," she said. "If it doesn't, the day after. And if the storm sits, then it sits, and we have soup for 4 days and dry wood for 3. She set her bowl down. "You'll bring in more from the porch and dry it out, rotate it. I'll handle the food and keep the inventory. I don't want either of us guessing at what's left." It was the most reasonable thing anyone had said to him all day, and it came from a woman whose suitcase held a signature page. He nodded and said nothing. They agreed on the loft and the bunk without discussing it. She took the bunk because it was closer to the stove, and he did not argue, and he climbed the ladder with the lantern and lay in the dark listening to the wind work at the shingles. He turned it over for a long time. He could confront her in the morning. He could take it to the board when they got down. He could photograph it, except his phone had no signal, and he had no idea whether that mattered. Underneath all of it sat the practical arithmetic, and Carson was an operations man before he was anything else. He was locked in a one-room cabin with the chief executive of the company that paid his mortgage in weather that could kill either of them, and the only 2 people on this ridge were the 2 of them. If he accused her tonight, they would spend the next 3 days trying not to freeze while refusing to look at each other. If he was wrong, he would be finished at Montgomery Dynamics before the pass reopened. So he would say nothing. He would carry the wood and mind the stove and get down the mountain, and then he would decide. Below him, the stove door opened and shut as Claire fed it a log, a thing she had claimed she did not know how to do. He listened and did not come down to help. The storm did not break in the morning. It thickened. Carson woke before light, with the loft cold enough that his breath showed, and came down the ladder to find the stove nearly out, and Claire asleep in her coat on the bunk. She had fed it once in the night and gotten the timing wrong. He rebuilt the bed of coals without waking her, and was at the door with an armload of wet cordwood before she opened her eyes. They fell into a shape without ever agreeing to it. Carson handled the fire, the wood, and anything with a broken hinge or a bad seal, and there was a great deal of all three. The window on the north wall had lost its glazing, and the wind came through it like a knife, so he cut a strip from the canvas tarp and tacked it over the frame with the back of a hatchet. Claire kept the food, the water, and the count, and every morning she wrote what remained on the back of an envelope in that small, hard, forward-slanting hand. He watched her burn her fingers on the soup pot and say nothing about it. He watched her wash 2 bowls in melted snow with her sleeves shoved to the elbow, a woman who had presided over a room of 40 executives without ever raising her voice, scraping a pot in a cabin at 11 degrees. On the second morning, she asked him to show her how to bank a fire so it would hold overnight. And she asked plainly, the way a person asks about something they intend to learn rather than something they intend to delegate. He showed her. She got it wrong twice and then got it right, and she did not thank him for the lesson or apologize for the errors, and Carson found to his irritation that he respected that. The days were long. There was no signal, no radio, no way to know whether the county had touched the pass, and the only clock was the stove. There was nothing to do but talk, or not talk, and after enough hours, the not talking became harder. She started it on the second night with a question that had nothing to do with anything. "Why did you take the freight contract apart in your first month?" Claire asked. "You had no mandate. You had barely been badged." Carson looked up from the stove. "Because it was rotten. It had been in place 9 years. That's why it was rotten." He set the poker down. Everybody kept renewing it because renewing it was easier than reading it. 19% once we rebuilt the network. 21 by the second year, Claire said. "I know the number." That stopped him in a way he did not expect. He had assumed for 2 years that the number had gone into a deck, and from the deck into a drawer, and that the woman at the head of the table had never once known whose work it was. The fire moved and the room shifted with it. Claire had pulled a chair around to face the stove, sitting sideways with her boots up on the fieldstone, and in that posture she did not look like anything Carson had ever seen at Montgomery Dynamics. "You've disliked me since you got there," she said. Not an accusation, the same flat tone she used to state a quarterly figure. Carson considered lying and decided against it. There was no professional advantage available in a room this small. "I have. Do you want to tell me why, or would you rather keep it?" "You cut 200 people in a morning and were in a lunch meeting by noon." 184, Claire said. "And the meeting was with a lender who was 4 hours from calling a covenant on the whole company. If I had missed it, it wouldn't have been 184. It would have been all of us." She turned the stove handle a quarter turn, watching the draft. "I've never explained that to anyone. It wouldn't have helped the 184. "You could have said something." "To whom?" "The people I'd just let go." She shook her head once. "There's a version of this job where you explain yourself constantly, and everyone likes you, and nothing survives the decade. My father ran that version." Carson had seen the name Montgomery on the building for 2 years and had never once thought of it as belonging to a man. "He built it in the 1980s, Claire said. "He was the most decent employer in the state, and he trusted a partner who took him apart from the inside over 4 years. He didn't see it because he didn't want to see it. He died 61 years old with the company in receivership, and I spent 11 years putting it back together." She took her boots off the stone. "So, yes, I keep distance. Distance is the only part of the job I've never gotten wrong. The wind pushed at the tarp over the north window, and the canvas breathed in and out. Carson sat with what she had handed him and could not make it fit against the file in the suitcase 4 feet from her elbow, and the not fitting was the first crack in a thing he had been certain of for 2 years. She was not cold. That was the discovery, and it was worse than the alternative. She was a woman holding a door shut with her shoulder, and she had been doing it so long she had forgotten there was another way to stand. By the 3rd day, they had stopped being careful with each other. She learned to split kindling badly and kept doing it. He learned she took her coffee black because there had never been anything else available in the years she was rebuilding. They ate the same soup and talked about supply lines and bad hires and a warehouse manager in Ohio they both could not stand. And twice she laughed a short, surprised sound, like something that had gotten out before she could stop it. That night, Carson counted the woodpile and found 2 lengths of hardwood left. The porch cordwood had been drying against the stone for 3 days and would burn now badly with more smoke than heat. He said nothing about it and noticed he had gone almost 8 hours without thinking about the suitcase. On the 4th morning, the wind dropped. It did not stop, but it turned, coming down off the ridge instead of across it, and around 10 o'clock. Claire's phone buzzed on the table where it had been sitting face down and dead for 3 days. Both of them looked at it. 1 bar, then 2. The mountain repeater had come back, or a piece of it had, and the phone began to pull down 4 days of the world in a stream of alerts that would not stop scrolling. Claire picked it up. Carson watched her face and saw the exact moment it changed, and it did not change the way faces change in a crisis. It went completely still. She turned the screen toward him without a word. The headline was from a financial wire service, time-stamped 2 days earlier. Montgomery Dynamics CEO under internal investigation over Ashford talks. Below it, a second story from a national outlet. Below that, a third and a fourth. The company's own communications office had confirmed the board had retained outside counsel. There was a photograph of Claire from an investor day taken from a low angle, and the caption used the word undisclosed. The stories all carried the same load, that Claire Montgomery had been in private contact with Vincent Ashford for months, that she had been negotiating a transfer of controlling interest behind the board's back. That documents existed. One outlet said a source had described a handwritten letter. Carson read the words handwritten letter and felt the cabin get very small. Claire scrolled without expression. The signal came and went. Pages loaded halfway and stalled. Voice needed more than the phone had. She typed a single line to a director named Harold Whitaker, watched it sit unsent for a full minute, and then deleted it, letter by letter. "Anything I send from this number today becomes an exhibit," she said. "Written on a mountain 4 days after the fact, with no way to prove when I wrote it. She could receive. That was all. She could sit in a 1-room cabin at 11 degrees, on a ridge the plows had not reached, and watch her name be taken apart in real time, and she could do nothing about it. 600 yards downhill, 22 of her own employees were in a lodge that would not get its signal back until that evening, and even if they had known, the ridge path had drifted over to the thigh in 4 days of wind. She read for 11 minutes, then set the phone down face up and put both hands flat on either side of it. "The board sits Thursday," she said. "Whatever council has, they'll put in front of them Thursday. Today's Tuesday. I'm aware." Carson stood by the stove with the poker still in his hand and understood he had reached the end of the promise he had made himself in the loft. He had told himself he would say nothing until they were down the mountain, but the reason for the silence had been that he did not know enough, and now there was a woman in front of him being accused in public of exactly what he had privately convicted her of, and the only person on this ridge who had seen the actual documents was him. If he stayed quiet now, it was no longer caution. It was a choice. "Claire." She looked up. He had never used her first name. In 2 years, not once. "The night we got here," Carson said. "The trunk didn't just knock your case over. It came open. The file came out on the floor, and the letter came out with it, and I read the cover sheet and the top page before I put any of it back. I saw Ashford's name. I saw a transfer of controlling interest, and a schedule of share classes, and a signature block with your name on it, and his. I saw a letter addressed to him in your handwriting, and I closed the case and told you nothing was missing. You lied to me." "I did. For 4 days. Yes." Claire stood up from the table slowly, and when she spoke, her voice had not risen at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. "And what did you decide I was—" Carson made himself say it. "I decided you were selling the company to him." She went to the suitcase. She did not open it in front of him at first. She stood over it with her back turned, and Carson watched her shoulders and understood she was deciding something considerably larger than whether to show him a file. Then she knelt, pressed the latch, took out both the folder and the letter, and brought them to the table under the lantern. "Read it properly this time," she said. "All of it, not the top page." Carson sat down and read. The cover sheet said what he remembered. The top page said what he remembered. What he had not seen because he had never turned it was the 28 pages behind it, and those pages were not an agreement. They were a defense. Vincent Ashford had accumulated a position of 19.4% through 3 holding entities that had never filed a joint disclosure, and Claire's counsel had built a document arguing the entities constituted a single acting group under the company's own charter, which capped any group at 15. The transfer schedule was not a sale. It was a table showing what Ashford would be forced to divest if the argument held. The signature block bearing 2 names sat at the foot of an unsigned settlement instrument, a proposal that he unwind to 12% voluntarily and sign a standstill for 4 years. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. Carson read it twice. It was addressed to Vincent because Claire had known the man since he sat on her father's board, and it said in language almost embarrassing in its directness that she was giving him one chance to stop this quietly before she filed. It was dated the 14th. The wire stories said her contact with Ashford had begun in the spring. "He's not my ally," Claire said. "He's had a hand on my throat since March. He wanted me to hand him operational control and take a title with no vote, and when I refused, he started building the position. I carried this up here on paper because our internal systems have been read before, and I wasn't going to hand him a copy of my own case." Carson set the letter down. His hands were not steady. I saw a signature block, and I stopped reading. "You saw what you already believed," she said. "That's what everyone will do on Thursday." Then she said the rest of it working through it out loud, the way she must have worked through 100 problems at the head of a table. 4 people inside the company had known she was preparing a charter challenge. The timing was not an accident. Ashford had known she was about to file, so he had put the same facts in front of the press with the meaning inverted, and he had done it during the 1 week she was unreachable 3 days before the board sat. He had not built a story. He had built a frame around a true document and let everyone finish the picture themselves. "He needs the board to remove me before I can file," Claire said. "A chief executive under investigation can't bring an action in the company's name. If they suspend me Thursday, the charter challenge dies with my authority, and by the time anyone untangles it, he'll be past 25%. Carson looked at the file on the table and the woman standing over it, and understood what he had just become. He was the only person alive who could testify that those documents had been in her private case in that exact form on that exact night before the story existed anywhere in the world. His word turned a leaked document back into what it actually was, and the man on the other side of it held 19% a seat at every table in the state, and somebody inside the building already working for him. Carson was an operations specialist with a mortgage. He would be testifying in a room full of directors who had every financial reason to want this over quickly, and he would still have to walk into that building on Monday. "You understand what I'd be walking into," he said. I understand exactly what you'd be walking into, Claire said. That's why I haven't asked. The county reached them at 8 the next morning. They heard the machines before they saw anything, a plow train grinding up the switchbacks, then a rescue crew coming up the ridge on a track vehicle with the lodge manager riding along to point the way. The pass had opened to single-lane traffic overnight. Everyone at the lodge had spent 4 nights on the floor of the great room around a fireplace the size of a garage door, and every one of them was fine. Carson put the fire out properly, closed the damper, and carried Claire's suitcase down to the vehicle, and she let him. Neither of them mentioned that it was the first time. At the bottom of the ridge before they got in, she stopped him. The board sits at 9 tomorrow. Council will have their findings. Ashford will have his people in the building and the press will be on the sidewalk. She was looking at the plowed road, not at him. You've been in that cabin 4 days, and you're going to want to do something about it. I'm telling you now while it's still easy. Don't. Claire, forget the file. Forget the letter. You never saw either. Her voice stayed exactly level. If you stand up in that room, you're not a witness. You're an employee of the accused, and they'll take you apart to get at me. Whatever happens tomorrow, I've had 6 years, and I built something. You have a career and a mortgage and no reason on earth to burn either one for a woman you've spent 2 years hating. Carson said her name again, and she did not let him finish. That wasn't a request. Protect yourself. Then she got into the vehicle. They rode down in separate rows and did not speak. At the lodge, she was absorbed immediately into a knot of people with phones and coats and questions, and Carson watched her put the face back on the one he had believed in for 2 years. He drove himself home in his own truck. He did not sleep. By the morning of the board meeting, the story had hardened past argument. 3 of the 4 people who had known about the charter challenge had already gone on record with council. The letter had leaked in photograph form, cropped to the salutation, so that the only visible words were Vincent and her signature. The stock had moved 14% across 3 sessions. 2 directors had told a reporter without attribution that the situation was untenable. Claire Montgomery walked into that building alone, carrying a defense that every fact in the public record now made look like a confession. The boardroom sat on the 11th floor and had a wall of glass facing east, and at 9 in the morning the light came in hard and flat and made everyone look like they had not slept. 9 directors, outside counsel at the end of the table with 2 associates and 4 boxes. The corporate secretary, Diane Prescott, taking the record. Claire at the far end in the chair she had occupied for 6 years, with the 28-page file closed in front of her and both hands resting on top of it. Carson was not in the room. He was on the 9th floor at his own desk with a supply schedule open on his screen, reading the same paragraph for the 3rd time. He had been in the building since 7. There were 2 camera crews on the sidewalk and a man from a wire service standing at the coffee cart, pretending to be an employee. On his floor, nobody was working. People stood in the aisles between desks talking in the flattened voice people use when they think the outcome is already known, and the word Carson kept hearing was inevitable. At 7:40, a man he had never met came to his desk. He introduced himself as counsel for Halloway Reserve Partners. One of the Ashford entities said he was in the building on an unrelated matter and asked how the retreat had been. Carson said it had been cold. The man smiled and said he understood Carson had spent several days in a cabin with the chief executive, and that this was the sort of thing that could become complicated for a person. Then he said there would be a restructuring after Thursday, regardless of the outcome, that operations would be consolidated, and that people who had been useful tended to be remembered. He left a card on the desk and did not wait for an answer. Carson had not touched the card. It was still sitting there face up at 9 o'clock. Upstairs, they were putting it to her. Counsel walked the board through it in order the way these things are always done. A chronology exhibits a summary of interviews. 3 employees who had known about the charter challenge told counsel that Claire had instructed them to keep the work off the internal systems. and 2 had characterized the instruction as unusual. Counsel noted without comment that the same instruction was consistent either with protecting privileged work product or with concealing an unauthorized negotiation. Then the letter, the photograph that had leaked, cropped to the salutation and the signature. Claire produced the original and passed it down the table, and it went hand to hand, and came back, and a director named Harold Whitaker, who had sat on that board since her father's time, said the thing everyone had been circling. "Claire, the letter says what it says. But it exists because you wrote to him privately, and you wrote to him privately because you have known this man since before you had this job. That's the problem, not the words, the relationship." Claire answered him directly. She laid out the charter argument, the 19.4%, the 3 entities, the 15%. Cap. She said the transfer schedule was a divestiture table, not a sale, and the settlement instrument was unsigned because Ashford had never been given the chance to sign it. She had been carrying it up a mountain when the story broke. "On paper," Whitaker said. "In a suitcase." "Yes. Which you have had in your sole possession the entire time." There it was, the whole case against her, in one sentence, and it was not really an accusation of wrongdoing. It was an accusation of unverifiability. Every page she was holding could have been assembled at any point in the past 6 days, by her alone, after she saw what the wire services were saying. There was no timestamp on a piece of paper, and no witness to a suitcase. The board did not need to believe she was guilty. They only needed to be unable to establish that she wasn't, and counsel had already told them a chief executive under open investigation could not bring an action in the company's name. 9 floors below, Carson sat with a business card on his desk and did the arithmetic he had been doing since 8 o'clock the night before. If he stayed where he was, nothing happened to him. That was the honest part. Nobody knew he had been in that cabin except a lodge manager, a rescue crew, 22 colleagues who had watched him carry a bag up a ridge, and 1 lawyer who had made it his business to find out. He had a mortgage and a job he was good at, and Claire Montgomery herself had stood at the bottom of a plowed road and told him to protect himself. He thought about a woman scraping a pot in melted snow with her sleeves pushed up. He thought about her getting the fire wrong twice, and then right, and about 2 years of certainty built on a parking garage rumor and a headcount number he had never once checked. And he thought about the only fact that actually mattered, that on the first night before any story existed anywhere in the world, he had knelt on a plank floor and read those exact pages out of that exact case. Carson stood up. He left the card where it was and went to the elevator. Diane Prescott stopped him outside the boardroom doors. Carson told her plainly that he had been in the cabin, that he had seen the documents on the night of the storm, and that the board was about to decide something without the one piece of information nobody in that room had. She went in. It took 4 minutes. Then the doors opened. 9 faces turned. Claire's was one of them, and when she saw him in the doorway, something crossed it that Carson had never seen there before and could not have named. "Mr. Bennett," Whitaker said, "you understand you're an employee of this company, and the subject of this inquiry is your chief executive." "I do." "Then say what you came to say." Carson stayed standing and told it in order the way an operations man tells anything, that the lodge had lost power on the first evening, and the generator had failed by dark. That the great fireplace kept 22 people alive on the floor of one room, that the guest cabin on the ridge was the only place with a stove and beds, and that he had been sent up because he could work a wood stove. He told them that on the first night, he had moved a cedar trunk, looking for dry kindling, that the trunk had struck Claire's suitcase, and that the case had been unlatched and had come open on the floor. He told them exactly what came out of it. A file with Vincent Ashford's name on the cover sheet. A handwritten letter folded once addressed to Vincent. He told them he had read the top page and seen the words, "Transfer of controlling interest, a schedule of share classes, and a signature block bearing 2 names. "And what did you conclude?" Whitaker asked. "That she was selling this company to him?" The room went very still. "I concluded it before I finished reading the page," Carson said. "I never turned it. I put the file back in the case, closed the latch, and told her nothing had happened. I lied to her about it for 4 days. I want that on the record because it matters for what I'm about to say next." He told them the rest, that the signal had come back on the 4th morning and both of them had read the wire story standing 3 feet apart with no way to make a voice call and no way to reach anyone. That he had confessed what he had seen and that Claire had then taken the file out of the case, put it in front of him, and made him read all 28 pages under a lantern. "The top page is a divestiture table," Carson said. "Not a sale. It's what he'd be forced to unwind if the charter argument holds. The signature block sits at the bottom of an unsigned standstill proposal. The letter is 2 paragraphs long, and it tells him to stop before she files." He looked down the table at counsel. "You have the original in front of you. It's dated the 14th. Whitaker leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett, you're describing documents this board has already seen. What are you adding?" "The date I saw them," Carson said. "The first wire story ran on the 2nd day of that storm. I read those pages the night before it. In that case, in that form, on a mountain, with no signal, no printer, and no way for anyone up there to know a story was coming. Nothing in that suitcase was assembled after the fact. It couldn't have been. I was there. That was the hinge, and every person in the room understood it at the same moment." A director halfway down the table said the obvious thing, that Carson worked for Claire, that his position depended on hers, that he had every reason to say what he had just said. Carson did not argue with it. "I've disliked her for 2 years. Ask anybody on the 9th floor. He kept his voice flat. "And at 7:40 this morning, a lawyer for Halloway Reserve Partners came to my desk and told me operations would be consolidated after today, and that people who'd been useful tended to be remembered. His card is still sitting on my desk. You can send someone for it." The temperature in the room changed. Whitaker asked for the name again, and Carson gave it, and counsel wrote it down, and one of the associates went out without being asked. Claire spoke then for the first time since he had come through the door, and she did not speak to Carson. She spoke to the board, and she put the second half of the case on the table. 4 people inside the company had known she was preparing a charter challenge. 3 had gone to counsel within 48 hours and told the truth as they understood it. The 4th was her own chief of staff, Marcus Reed, who had built the retreat's shuttle schedule and knew to the hour when she would be out of contact and who had not spoken to counsel at all. She gave them the internal access log. The charter work had been queried on the 11th from a terminal with no business touching it 3 days before her letter was written. The building's own badge record showed the same person entering her office suite at 9:10 on the night of the 15th, the evening before the retreat, when the letter had been lying on her desk waiting to go out. "That's where the photograph came from," Claire said. "It's cropped to the salutation, because that is all you can see of a letter lying flat on a desk." Ashford had not needed to invent anything. He had needed to know what was coming, publish a true document with its meaning inverted, and time it to the 1 week she could not answer. Counsel took the log. The associate came back with the card. Whitaker called a recess that lasted 40 minutes, and Carson spent it in a corridor watching the camera crews on the sidewalk below. When the board reconvened, it moved quickly. The allegations against Claire Montgomery were withdrawn in full, and the internal investigation was closed. A formal action was authorized against Vincent Ashford and the 3 holding entities under the 15% charter cap to be filed in the company's name that afternoon. A separate inquiry was opened into Marcus Reed, and the 3 employees who had spoken to counsel were expressly cleared, and Claire Montgomery remained chief executive of Montgomery Dynamics. It was not clean. 2 directors abstained on the charter filing, and one of them said for the record that a company should never be 4 minutes and 1 witness away from removing its own leadership. Carson thought that was the truest thing anybody said in that room all morning. It cost him the way he had known it would. The operations consolidation happened anyway. It had been in motion before any of this, and the Holloway lawyer had simply used it as a threat because it was true. Carson's team was folded into a larger group under a director he had spent 2 years quietly disagreeing with. He kept his title. He lost his reporting line and half his scope. He also stopped being invisible on the 9th floor, and not entirely in a good way. There were people in that building who had assumed the outcome and said so out loud, and who now had to walk past the man who had gone up to the 11th floor and undone it. Nobody said anything. Everybody knew. Claire changed more slowly and more permanently. The first thing she did was tell them. 2 weeks after the board meeting, she stood in front of the entire company and laid out what Ashford had done, what the charter action was, what the risk to their jobs actually was, and what she had gotten wrong. She said the word wrong about herself out loud in front of 400 people, which nobody in that room had ever heard her do. Then she said the part that mattered, that she had spent 11 years believing distance was the only thing protecting the company. That her father had been destroyed because he trusted a man who had earned nothing, and she had decided the answer was to trust no one, and that the past week had shown her the price, because when the story broke, there had not been one person in 400 who assumed she was innocent. There had been no reason for anyone to. She started sitting in on operations reviews without an agenda. She learned the names of people 3 levels below her and used them. When the charter action settled the following spring, and Ashford was forced to unwind to 9% and sign a 7-year standstill, she announced it from the floor of the distribution center instead of from a podium. She was not warm. She was never going to be warm. But the door she had been holding shut with her shoulder for 11 years, she began deliberately to let stand open. Carson's own reckoning was smaller and harder to look at. He had built a person out of a headcount number he never checked, a rumor he never traced, and a face that never explained itself. And then, on the floor of that cabin, he had been handed the proof he wanted and felt relief. That was the part that stayed with him, not the mistake. The relief. He had wanted her to be what he had decided she was, because it was easier than admitting he had been judging a woman he had never once tried to know. He had stopped in the middle of the first page of a 28-page document and believed he understood everything. Every person who read the Wire stories did exactly the same thing, and he had no standing to look down on a single one of them. They found their way to something afterward. It did not look like forgiveness, and it never got named. It looked like 2 people who had learned each other in a cold room and could not go back to pretending they hadn't a chief executive who now asked before she decided, and an operations man who said the difficult thing to her face on the first day, instead of carrying it up a mountain in silence. Trust built the slow way out of a storm neither of them had chosen. Don't decide who a person is from the outside of them, or from the one page you happen to see. The truth is almost always further in than the place you stopped reading. It takes patience to reach it, and courage to stand up for it once you have, and only then do you find out what another person is actually worth, and what you are.